strategies on infusing deafblind-related content into IEP curriculum, a share stop amongst instructors. First, I'd like to do, my name is Carrie White, and I will be your MC for tonight, and I have some housekeeping items I need to review before we get started. Captioning and interpreters are provided. The streaming window opens automatically. There is a tab for the audio and video on the far right. Click on the bottom corner and the menu will drop down. Click Detach Panel. Then you can resize the video box. To open the captioning, click on the captioning icon on the toolbar. Windows can be closed or sized to create your personalized viewing environment. If you have technical issues, use the chat function and a member of the clearinghouse staff will aid you. Questions for the presenter tonight will be put into the chat function. Susan encourages audience interaction, so you're more than welcome to type in questions as we go or ask for clarification. I would like to thank Susan Morgan-Morrow for coming here tonight, and thank you to our interpreters, Kirk and Darlene, and our captionist, Carrie O'Brien. And of course, our clearinghouse team, which is Jessie and all her helpers. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Susan Morgan-Morrow.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. It's definitely evening out here because I'm on the East Coast, so we've got a late start out here. I see we've got folks joining us from quite across the mile, so it's nice to have this webinar opportunity so we can connect across the miles. Very different than just even recent past, where it was very difficult to share information across technology, but the world is changing around us. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to thank Carrie and the folks at the Marie Center and also in connection with the Katie Center at St. Catherine University. They're the ones who were able to coordinate this and get it all put together. They also will be your go-to folks when it comes to CEUs. Thankfully, that's not my job tonight. So I know we have a variety of people who are joining us. While the presentation is geared towards interpreter educators, the content is still applicable to working practitioners, interpreters who are working in the field, because I think this content is important regardless of your position, because it will definitely influence and advise your work as you go out into the community and work with the broad spectrum of consumers that we know we work with. So as Carrie was telling you, I would encourage you please to use the chat box. I don't know if this is your first time joining a webinar, and it might be a new experience for you. It's a little bizarre that you can see me and I can't see you. So a nice way to be able to connect, at least across the virtual space, is to use the text chat box. So that's down there on the left-hand side, and I would absolutely encourage you to use that. I will do my best to check in to see if there are questions there, like Carrie was mentioning, and she'll also help facilitate those in case I overlook anything. So before we get started, just to kind of get a feel for the audience, if you could, we'll go ahead and practice using that text chat box now. If you could just indicate what your role is, if you are an interpreter educator, if you are a working interpreter, or a different role, any other professionals who may be interested in joining tonight where the information is applicable. If you're a teacher for the vision impaired, for example. So go ahead and indicate that in the text chat box. I'll give you a second to type that in. And two people are still joining the session. I'll be running out from dinner to try and log on. Well, while you use that text chat box, let me go ahead and talk about what I was aiming to cover this evening. Here on the screen is an agenda. We want to talk about mainly this concept of sort of special settings versus So in case you didn't see me enough on the webcam, I guess, there's a picture for you. So to give a little background about myself, I've been in the field of interpreting now for a while, probably close to 2 decades. I didn't come into the field, though, as an interpreter. So my school of training was definitely more the school of hard knocks because I was fortunate to learn from the community. My background, I have a master's degree in rehabilitation counseling for the deaf from Gallaudet University. And so that actually is the first time that I had met a deafblind person. So being on the campus at Gallaudet obviously gives you more opportunity to meet a wide range of individuals. So, but it was from there when I started my career, as I graduated with my master's degree, my first career job was at Helen Keller National Center. And Helen Keller is the only national training center in the United States for individuals with combined hearing and vision loss. So it's a comprehensive training center where people come and stay for a period of time, depending on what the need is, for communication training, vocational training, independent living skills, etc. So it was during my tenure there where I went from a world of what would be considered just sort of deafness in the deaf community headlong into deaf blindness, and what a learning experience that was, because of course in my training there was a blip of information mentioned about people with vision loss, but then I had the good fortune of spending every day with a very large number of people who are deafblind, probably up to around 30 people, 40 people who have been in training at any given time. And having that sort of exposure, as you can imagine, on a daily basis greatly influences your perspective, your work, and your skills. So it was during that time that I actually became an interpreter. I was sort of learned the art of interpreting through working with deafblind people. So again, a very unique perspective as it relates to the general field of interpreting. For me, it was more of, oh, you can't really see that person over there. Oh, let me relay that message. So it was actually through a world of access in terms of vision. So from there, I went to work on the national project on deafblindness, and it was during those days that I started doing a lot of work with interpreters throughout the country and started really seeing what a great divide there was between that famous quote, I do deafblind interpreting or I don't do deafblind interpreting. And for me, that was a problem because it became starkly clear that as a field, we were making a very clear, decisive decision of what types of consumers we are willing and able to provide interpreting services to. So that became a problem for me. And so in my work then, became focused on that particular issue, asking the questions about, well, what is that about? What's behind the drive for someone to say that they don't do that type of work? So from there, I went on then to I was the chairperson for the deafblind member section for RID for a great number of years, where we, as you all know, if you're connected with RID, is a special interest group. And so it's kind of to push along that philosophy of spreading information and content about deafblindness. And then my colleague, Jenny Pope, who was the former executive director of the American Association of the Deafblind, and myself put forth a proposal at one of the RID conferences to establish a national task force on deafblind interpreting, because we felt that enough is enough. This great divide remains to be a great divide. And so a partnership then was developed, a very broad and extensive partnership was developed then between RID, AADB, the National Consortium of Interpreter Education Centers, and different partners came together to address this issue on more of a global sort of level. And from that, there have been some great resources developed and some great partnerships and influence. So what have you. So anyway, so just kind of leading to not so much about me per se, but just about why this is an important issue and how I felt that it was and how what we've been seeing over the years throughout the country. And we'll talk more about that as it relates to the National Task Force. I'm reviewing some of the comments about people who, in terms of current perspectives. So we have some interpreting students. This is perfect. This is exactly who we want to have in the audience. Interpreter educators, working interpreters, teacher for the visually impaired, perfect. VRS interpreters, great. So it's nice to see that we have a broad spectrum of folks who would have influence and where this content would be applicable. So this relates to the overall purpose of why this is important to have this conversation, and I began to allude to that. Because particular to the interpreter education programs that are there, historically have not been successful in incorporating deafblind related content into the curriculum. That's a blanket statement. It's an easy statement, and we know that that's true. It's not just hearsay. It's factual. And for those of you who have graduated from an IEP, you can speak from your own experience, I'm sure. Because there's no main requirement of what sort of content should be incorporated. What we find is from that experience then, people go into the field and of course are left ill-equipped to work with individuals who are deafblind. People don't have an understanding about what that definition is, what is the meaning of deafblindness, and of course if I say the words deafblind, the first mode of communication that comes to mind, of course, is tactile. And so there is quite a myth that becomes pervasive in the field in terms of what the expectations are for communication support. So to address this issue and to get a little more information about sort of the current pulse of the interpreter education programs, in 2007, this takes us back a little ways now, one of the first tasks that we took on the National Task Force was to conduct a national survey. We wanted to find out, well, what really is going on out there in the IEPs? Maybe there was more happening than we realized. Maybe there were great resources that we weren't quite familiar with or weren't quite using as well as we should. So we conducted this survey, and sad but true, our guesstimations were correct, and that there is a very wide range of the type of content that is covered and where those resources come from, who teaches that content, etc. And so the bottom line is that the information, it was quite dismal in terms of representation and incorporation into the curriculum. So this became one of the main issues and interests of the task force, to try and see a way to create some resources and pull people together. So what we're left here, and I'm going to kind of jump back and forth a little bit, but what we're left here is really a theoretical dilemma. And I say that because we sort of have this divide in terms of perspective on what this quote-unquote deafblind interpreting relates to. What does that really mean? And these are some of the words that come up when we start talking about that. Special settings, specialized settings, versus just a broad spectrum of consumers. And I want to talk a little about that more in depth. See, we all learn when we have friendly faces in front of us. So as our good friend Grover once said, one of these things is not like the other ones. And that definitely relates to this topic when we talk about, is it a matter of setting or access? And when I say one of these things is not like the other, it's when we talk about settings. If you talk to interpreters, and we've done surveying, and you say, let's talk about the various quote-unquote settings where interpreting services are provided, you get a quick list, and it rattles off the top of people's heads. You say, of course, medical is a specialized setting, educational is a specialized setting, legal, theatrical, religious, mental health, and 9 times out of 10, you will also hear deafblind interpreting. So if we actually stop and think about that for a second, does that actually make sense? Can deafblind interpreting be its own setting? And of course, I'm setting you up with that question. The answer is no, right? Because deaf-blind interpreting isn't a place. These are all actual locations where a particular type of content is being interpreted, specific type of vocabulary that is necessary, content knowledge that is necessary to make that interpreting exchange more successful, as opposed to deaf-blind interpreting. And so we want to talk about that. So we need to start thinking about this concept of deaf-blind interpreting a little differently. And again, even though this conversation initially is to address interpreter education programs, if you're an interpreter and you're sitting there and you might have a little aha moment thinking, you may have answered that question yourself a little bit, similarly to what is here on the slide before we had this conversation. I just saw there was a recent publication that came out last year in 2011 by a well-known, respected author in our field of interpreting. And as I opened up the table of contents and looked down under specialized settings, and deaf-blind interpreting was there listed. So this is and remains to be an issue, and I think because there's lack of knowledge about the topic in general. So I think we're really talking about sort of this misnomer, this overgeneralization about what deaf-blind interpreting is. So if we get to start thinking a little differently about this, and you think about this sort of settings versus something else issue, because if you sit back and think about it, deaf-blind people, these are individuals, go to every sort of setting or environment that deaf-sighted people do. So we have to start thinking about, well, whatever job you go to, think about every scenario that you've interpreted in, that there's always the likelihood that that person can have a vision issue. So it truly can't be about settings. It has to be about something else. It has to be about the person and the needs of that person in terms of accessing communication. So if I go back here to this question that Grover asks us, is it really a matter of setting or is it a matter of access? And so what I would like to encourage you to think about is it's the access issue, right? And we'll talk even more about the linguistic component as well. So here you can already start thinking about different types of settings you've been in. So of course you've been in those medical settings and in educational settings and what have you. And in any one of those scenarios, a person with different ranges of vision loss could have been present. So folks, I think here what we're talking about is it more than just a thought about it, it's really a paradigm shift. And as our pal here on the computer says, I thought I felt a paradigm shift, but it was just really my undershorts riding up. Because we start to talk about these things and they feel uncomfortable, and so we just kind of skirt by them, right? We don't want to talk about it because our work is busy, our schedules are full, the interpreter education programs don't have time to put in extra content. There's no time for an extra course. And so understanding that, I'd like to propose different ways to incorporate this information and to get that underway. So we are asking for a bit of a shift. So it's really more in thinking about things differently. And then in terms of the teaching aspect, it really is a shift in pedagogy. So in order to address that, then we need to talk to folks like you, people who are out there in the field as the educators carrying on a message. Excuse me. So back to that survey that the National Task Force had hosted, those were some of the questions that we had also for the interpreter educators, because it's not just about the program and how it's designed, it's who's teaching in those programs. And so what we know is that some educators have reported that they themselves don't have the content knowledge or the area of expertise, so if they don't possess that, how can they turn around and teach that content to the students, which is a very valid point. So this is another piece that I wanted to address tonight. We should talk about, as an educator, how can I enhance my knowledge base and how can I do that easily? So I wanted to encourage you to not only sort of engage in this sort of paradigm shift, but then also a shift in your pedagogy. So this is a little visually complicated, but here's an example. So I want us, again, back to the idea of this spectrum of consumers, right? Excuse me. So this is a way, if we wanted to look at the spectrum of language users, if we wanted to look at very strong visual ASL users all the way across the spectrum to people who are very straight or English signers. So we already know about that linguistic variation, and we know that in our work, we use our skills to observe and adapt our language skills to meet the needs of the individual. So we are already working across a spectrum in terms of language access and linguistic access. So if we take those individuals and we put them into different settings, right? So we take that very visual ASL user and put them in a medical setting. That's that big diverse stretch over there. Or you take the English user and you put them in the medical setting. In that case, you're already modifying. You're modifying your output. You're modifying your vocabulary choice to meet the needs of that individual. So what I would like to propose is that we think about deafblindness in the same regard. So you think about that of an individual who is an ASL user, for example, who's going to the doctor. So you're taking those same language skills in that same environment that you already accepted the job for the deaf-sighted person, and now we just have to think about the issue of access. So it's not about the content, it's not about your knowledge base or your level of comfortability, because you've already taken the job for the doctor appointment. Now you have to think about how do I support access to that person? And another layer that we can put on top, along that top horizontal line, what we also can do is put the spectrum of varying degrees of vision loss. If we did that, this picture would be so complicated, you couldn't visually understand it. But we have to think about how things, in terms of life experiences, are layered. So we have a linguistic layer, right? And I'm just asking you to think about, then we also have that visual layer, because you can have that same ASL user going to the doctor who happens to have low vision. So meaning perhaps they just have blurry vision and they can't see very far. Well, that's not too terribly difficult to accommodate, because in the doctor's office, you're already sitting closer than you normally would in a larger setting. So there may be times when you work with someone who is actually considered to be deafblind, but actually they don't really need modifications because the setting is good, your seating arrangement is fine, etc. So it is a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of thinking about these people, those people that interpreters have out and out said, I don't work with that group of people. So I think we need to start thinking about that, how we as practitioners think about it, and how we have dialogue with our colleagues about it. So, what's the solution? Well, we have to start at the beginning. If we're thinking about interpreter education programs, then we need to think about embedding deafblind related content all throughout the curriculum. It's not just a special place. It's not just a special course, because the further we perpetuate this idea of something that's different or separate, that's what it will remain, and that's how our field will view this as. So here are some suggestions on how to do that. Except I'm looking at the chat box. I'm just checking in. Elizabeth says, you're rocking our world. I hope that means your paradigm shift didn't make you fall off your chair, but perhaps that's a good rock. And Debbie is a working interpreter, has a deafblind friend at a local deaf church each weekend, so interested how to better meet the needs of this person and others. So those are really good conversations to have and say, okay, so in this specific setting, and there may be some particular demands, what are some strategies on how to make that more of a successful communication experience? And so that's a great one. And so if we have some time at the end, I'd love to be able to talk about that more. And Elizabeth is saying, yes, changing the curriculum tomorrow. Excellent. All right, our work here is done. We can close the webinar. Elizabeth will take you all throughout the country, and you can talk to all the other IEPs. Good. So let's move on to talk a little bit about that. So how do you do it when you're teaching? So let's say you're teaching in the interpreter education program, or you are a professional in the field and you're giving awareness trainings, you're doing professional development yourself. And even in conversation, I mean, I'm talking specifically about teaching it, but even in conversation as practitioners with your colleagues, there are ways to embed this type of conversation. So when you're talking about the deaf community, what you want to talk about then is just provide examples of people in the deaf community, those deaf community members who have different types of vision loss. And you have to constantly use scenarios for interpreters to learn. There are always, okay, here's the paragraph that tells you the assignment. This is the scenario, the person's going to, college, here's the environment, et cetera, and then practice in those scenarios. So what I would challenge you then is always to be talking about, you talk about the deaf person or the deaf people that they are practicing with, or they're envisioning that they're practicing with, that we're always encouraging the use of saying, oh, and that deaf person, this person has reduced fields of vision. And maybe if you don't have that language to incorporate in, later in the slides, we'll share some resources with you where you can get some of that language yourself. But a lot of people have said, well, that information is overwhelming because the field of vision is complicated. Those of us who have more of a deaf background, presumably most people on this webinar, we understand the hearing component. You understand what an audiogram looks like probably. You understand when you talk about profound hearing loss versus moderate, mild. You understand that sort of language and the difference between ASL and PSE and all of that. But when we start throwing words around about vision, it gets confusing and convoluted because we haven't had that training. And that's a natural expectation because that's not the field that you're in. So what I would suggest then is to think about vision in more simple terms. And so that way, if you talk about it more simply, it is easier then for the students to comprehend or your participants to understand. So I would suggest that you look at it in 3 different categories that are listed here. So if we can talk about vision in 3 ways, people who have close vision, or also referred to as low vision. Secondly, as having reduced fields of vision or reduced peripheral fields, or no usable vision. So if you can break it down in those sort of categories for your learners, it's an easier way for people to start to comprehend information and then be able to talk about strategies in terms of access. So I was just, thinking about things categorically. And so then how do we do that? So what we want to think about is using very low cost or literally no cost ways to simulate vision. So you want to think about what sort of supplies you have at home, because you can buy a fancy kit that's, $200 that provides you with some different lenses that will simulate different types of vision loss. Definitely, if that's in your budget, I would absolutely encourage it. But there are also other simple ways to do this. And as you can see, my very fancy 99-cent store items can make a significant impact on your learners or on the people who are experiencing this. So for example, if you want to simulate close vision or low vision, you want to take that saran wrap or a sandwich bag, and you can get a box of 100 for 99 cents. So you can never argue that you didn't have it in the budget. But you can simulate different levels of vision loss simply by holding up that sandwich bag. If you hold it up in its original layer, that vision is impacted. It's a little bit blurred, but not too difficult. And as you fold the bag down, obviously the thickness of the vision gets worse. So you want to think about ways then that incorporate this experience during your interpreting courses, right? So anytime you're going to have a practice scenario, at least once throw in an experience using some of these simulators and do that on a regular basis. Okay, so now we're going to talk about an individual who has low vision. Everyone pull out your sandwich bag, right? Because we can talk about things and talk about them and talk about them until you actually sort of get your feet wet and get an idea of, aha, now I'm the recipient. I understand why this is difficult, and that will influence then how I make modifications to make it better the next time. So then to simulate reduced fields of vision. So that's most commonly when we talk about Usher syndrome. Well, it's very easily done by using a toilet paper roll or a paper towel roll, or if you don't even have those handy, you always have a piece of paper, right? So you can take your piece of paper and roll that up lengthwise, and students can simulate their own vision loss, right? So you have them hold these up during an actual activity. Very, very quickly they will learn how significantly they have to modify their sign language output in order to make it accessible to their communication partner. Excuse me. And then, of course, no usable vision, well, that's easily done. Simply get some scarves or some different type of blindfold, meaning the person may not be completely blind, but perhaps they really don't have functional vision that allows them to access their world in a visual sense. If that's the case, now we are talking about tactile communication and tactile sign language, and there are obviously a lot of strategies to help facilitate that mode of communication, which is probably a more advanced level than many people are prepared to teach, but there are still ways to get that information across. And not that we expect every interpreter who leaves the IEP to be these skilled practitioners particularly in terms of tactile, but I think doing some of these activities will help sort of break down that tactile defensiveness or that tactile concern that many interpreters carry. So if we can sort of break down some of those barriers in terms of attitudinal barriers, then I think we're already ahead of the game. So some other strategies. So as an instructor or a teacher in any respect, whenever you're designing your homework assignments or projects, I would always encourage you then to include one example or sort of a case example of an individual who is deafblind, and trying to use different sort of scenarios where we're not always talking about tactile. We want to try and stay away from that also, because we want to continue to emphasize the broad spectrum of individuals with varying degrees of vision loss and different types of vision loss. And you may say, well, I don't really know how to do that, but we want to encourage you that there are many resources that are available. I've put a link here to the National Consortium on Deafblindness. Excuse me. And that is nationaldb.org. They are the federal grant, the only one national grant that provides support specific on deafblindness. And their website has a wealth of information. It is really the clearinghouse of information on deafblindness. And you can go to the topic, there's a list of different subjects, and you go to the topic that says interpreting. And under there, you'll see a whole host of resources. Within there are some scenarios. So you say, I don't want to recreate the wheel. Let me look at, there might be some scenarios available to me that I can select. So those are opportunities. So some things that are readily available. There's also a whole host of different types of resources that you can access on the national site. It also gives you information about trainings that are available and what have you. So it's kind of a go-to place in terms of deafblind content. And now, because we are in a techno world, we also want to see current stuff. We want to see current video, current, state-of-the-art type of things. And we're quite lucky because NCIEC, the National Consortium of Interpreter Education Centers, just recently captured some great video footage, and they have little segments called In Their Own Words, and they did direct interviews with deafblind individuals of varying life experiences, kind of telling their story. So these are some great clips that are available for you, free of use, that you can incorporate into your lectures or into your homework assignments. Very easy to say, just tell the students, go and watch three vignettes and write a perspective about that. You know, what was the impact? What did you learn about those deafblind people's experiences? So there are definite ways to incorporate content and activities into your curriculum without overburdening what is already required and necessary for the program. Other ways. So we want content and things to read, we want videos to watch, but of course, we want to bring people into your classroom as much as possible or into your workshops. And so how can you do that? And most of the time, our budgets are pretty strapped. It's difficult to pay someone to come in, definitely on an ongoing basis, but there are different ways to do that. So of course, the best would be live in-class presenters. So I'm talking about people who they themselves are deafblind that can give you direct perspective from their life experience. So live in-class presenters, of course, are always the best. But if that can't be done, just based on your own location, just in terms you may be in more of a rural environment and you don't have access to a large deafblind community. So if that's the case, you want to be able to access people in a different way. So what we started doing, I've done with different programs, and I've heard other people doing, excuse me, is bringing people in through distance technology. I mean, the beauty of webcams, look at what we're doing right now, right? We're bringing content right into your living room or your office, wherever you're sitting, and it's just fascinating. I've posted a whole variety of other webinars through my site on Deafblind Tip. And what we've done then, we've had the opportunity then is to bring deafblind people virtually into your living room. And that's the way we learn best, is to hear directly from deafblind people. So while people may not have that hands-on, literally hands-on experience communicating with deafblind people, at least to be able to see and interact, ask questions, see the language use in action is very impacting. So using video phones, many deafblind people use a video phone either independently or with support, and could come into your classroom that way, or again, via the web on webcam. And if someone is a tactile communicator, it's really a great experience particularly for students, to be able to see that live interaction between an interpreter and the deafblind person, and how the tactile communication works. Then, of course, there's always recorded presentations that are available, probably that you don't realize. There's actually quite a few. There's an old curriculum that's been around. I say old, I just said that and really emphasize it. And the bad part is I edit it, so so it's old. It was the only, and is still to date, the only national curriculum that was designed for deafblind interpreting. And while the information or the video is pretty dated in terms of aesthetics, the content remains the same. The strategies really remain the same. I mean, of course, there's always new ideas and new concepts, but basically, generally speaking, some of those are the same. And so that is accessible to you. And later on, I'll show you the link to where you can find that. You can simply go onto YouTube and put in deafblind or deafblind tactile, deafblind interpreting, and you will find a host of clips, some that have been posted by deafblind people themselves. And so again, looking at no-cost ways to sort of bring deafblind people or deafblind content virtually into your classroom. Perkins is Perkins School for the Blind, and they have a great site that has free training and free information, different sort of resources, and some recorded presentations on very specific content topics. So, for example, they have a presentation specifically on charge syndrome. That's C-H-A-R-G-E. So charge syndrome, being one of the etiologies that causes deaf blindness, would be great content for interpreters or interpreting students to learn about, because if they're going to be going into the educational environment working with students, they very well could run into a student who has charge syndrome who needs some modifications to sign language. So there are a whole host of resources out there. And of course, as you see in bold here, what you want to do is you don't want to reinvent the wheel, because there are some sort of canned or prepared presentations specifically on deafblind content that are available. More specifically, again, NCIEC was just designing a pilot curriculum. I know that they are kicking it off actually this fall, and they're sort of piloting it in, I believe, 15 different programs throughout the country. And because it's a federal grant, that means that content is available to you for free to use. And they have given me permission to tout that message. So you want to look to your colleagues to see what is out there, what's available. And if you don't know where to find that, the National Consortium is the place to go. You can always reach out to the National Task Force on Deafblind Interpreting. They're very easy to find. Everybody is accessible. I'll type it here, NTFDBI. They have it a Gmail address. And those are your go-to people to ask for some resources as well. So, and of course, if you can't, there's always different layers of information and layers of content, right? So if you can't bring the people in, well, you know what? There's always pictures. And yes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And it's true, because you can at least show, think about, you know, how you can have discussion just based on some of these pictures that are here. Say, aha, look at how these two are seated. They're using tactile sign language. I would have never thought that they would sit this far apart from each other. Why do you think that's possible? Why do you think that works? What is his leading hand? Is he left-hand dominant or right-hand dominant? And what about the consumer who's receiving the information? So there's always ways that we can still use resources, and they don't even have to be fancy or costly resources. And you can get these pictures and a whole host of pictures just through our friend Google. So you go to Google Images and you put in tactile sign language or deafblind interpreting, and you will get a very nice array of images that are available. If you don't know about them, you don't know how to describe them, then there's always a way to reach out and to ask for support for that. I'd be happy to help with that. Go to the task force. There are resources out there to support you. So our little friend here, the mouse with the helmet, as he approaches the mousetrap, he's prepared, right? So it's all about preparation. And that's what we need to do. So as an instructor then, you have to think about what do you need to do in order to portray this information. How do you share this information? If you yourself are not comfortable with the content or just don't have had the opportunity, how can you kind of beef up your own skills? Well, let's share some of those ideas here. Of course, it makes sense to have specific training, right? So if you're able to have access to specific content training on deafblind interpreting, that is the best, where you can get some hands-on experience. There is a seminar that's held at Helen Keller National Center here on Long Island. I'm actually in New York, that I host every year, and that has been one of the best experiences, because as you can imagine, this is the deafblind in terms of regional, or excuse me, in terms of the rehabilitation environments, where you'll see a variety of individuals. So you get a whole bunch of content, and then you get interaction with individuals, not only during the day, but also at night in the residence, because people stay on campus. There is also an amazing camp that's out west, in just west of Seattle, that is recreation focused. It is really a social and recreation opportunity. Oh, I see Danielle actually mentioned it here. Thanks, Danielle. So the CVET camp, amazing. So look for those sort of opportunities, and that's listed here, you can see. But before we go on to that, in terms of professional training, there are so many ways that you can enhance your own knowledge base now just by staying in your own office. You don't have to go anywhere, just like you're doing right now, sitting on this webinar. There are a whole host of webinars that are offered for free or low cost, where you can earn CEUs and enhance your own professional knowledge. So again, I mentioned Perkins School for the Blind. They have a host of professional development series opportunities free of charge. NCDB, that's the National Consortium on Deaf Blindness that I mentioned, they also host webinars. I mentioned DB Tip, which is the business that I host, and I have a whole host of items there. But you also can turn to, I would encourage you to turn to your state deafblind projects. If you don't know, every single state has a federal grant that provides support to kids and young adults who are deafblind. That's the job that I host. I am the project coordinator of the New York Deafblind Collaborative. And what we do is a whole variety of support all around deafblindness. And one of the main pieces is on training and awareness. And we are all charged with using technology, distance technology, in a way to bring content out to folks. So no matter what state you're in, you have a deafblind project, and to reach out to them. You can, if you don't know where your deafblind project is or who those folks are, you can go to nationaldb.org, excuse me, and put in under Find People and Places. And so when you do that, you will be able to identify your state and the folks who are your directors, and they can also provide you with information about trainings happening in your area or resources. And many of these states, actually probably all of these state deafblind projects, also have simulators. And so you're then able to borrow those simulators, use them in your classroom, what have you. Jumping down to the bottom, talking about Helen Keller National Center, there are regional representatives located all throughout the country, and if you're not connected with that rep, I would absolutely encourage you to do that. They can come in and also do awareness trainings that would be extremely helpful for you. And their website is just hknc.org, and you can find your regional rep there. So there are different ways where you can bring people in free of charge. You can bring resources in free of charge. Content is available. Now, about the fun stuff. So it's not just about sitting in a workshop or watching a webinar. It is about the fun stuff. And so we've mentioned CBEC, which is an amazing camp that is intense and very uplifting and exhausting. We have to throw that in because fun always comes with exhaustion. And for those of us who have attended the AADB conferences, American Association of the Deafblind, know what I'm talking about, because those are the best times for any sort of learning to take place, because you're outside the classroom, being with people in their natural state. There are many different types of deafblind retreats that are also held throughout the country. Michigan has a very strong one. I'm involved with the Southeast Transition Network for young adults who are deafblind, and last year I coordinated the interpreters and SSPs for that event. And again, this January for Martin Luther King weekend in the South. And those are wonderful opportunities because we're able to draw in the local interpreter education program to provide support. The interpreter educators have come and use this as an opportunity, as a learning opportunity. So these are ways for you as educators to beef up your own skills and get more knowledge, and then bring them back to your students, and then see ways that you can pull your students in to get them also to volunteer. There are definitely other events that happen throughout the country. Another opportunity is with the Charge Foundation. So this is an organization for people who have the parents, most likely the parents of children who have Charge syndrome. And they have a conference every 2 years. Last year, I coordinated the interpreters for that event, and as you can imagine, we needed to have a whole host of interpreters, and we were able to come in and have just a great learning experience while communication was taking place. So a lot of volunteer opportunities. And I think, too, setting that precedent, if you do volunteering your students will understand the importance of volunteering and understanding that it's not only at the typical sort of deaf club or the deaf event, it's different types of events that, again, will allow them opportunities to see different types of consumers. And of course, in terms of materials, so as an instructor, you want to become familiar with what types of materials are out there. I mentioned the national curriculum, so that is a resource, and that is available actually on this website who's hosting this webinar. They are the folks who have housed it. It's in their clearinghouse, and you can download the entire curriculum for free. They've made that available. Excuse me. That came from the negotiation and the work of the National Task Force to get those materials available because it was created with a federal grant and it was difficult to access. It was difficult to find. Now it's available. There are some video footage that also can be downloaded or streamed. It's pretty hefty content, so it takes a while. Make sure you have enough memory on your computer, but once you have it, it's available to you for your use. There is another tool that's called the Interpreting Strategies. Interpreting Strategies for Deafblind Students, an interactive training tool for educational interpreters. That's a manual and an interactive DVD that I designed for Ohio that's being used more broadly. Even though it says for educational interpreters, the content is really applicable for many, many environments. And it has an interactive DVD that allows for sort of viewing and assessing, and there are some sort of quizzes that you can use. So there are materials that are available to you, again, so you don't have to recreate the wheel. And sort of the book that's been around the longest and is probably most recognized is the bottom one here, which is Guidelines, Practical Tips for Working and Socializing with Deafblind People, written by Teresa Smith. While that book is quite anecdotal and gives you great perspective in terms of the cultural experience regarding deafblindness and more of a community perspective, great pieces for people to pull into a learning environment. So there are some major resources that are available to you out there that again, are there for free or very low cost that are pretty easy to access. Now, one important tool that I have to mention is this one here. During my tenure with the National Task Force, along with some of my colleagues, and I believe I see Rhonda Jacobs here online with us tonight, we wanted to address this issue, just the fact that the Interpreter Education Program is so chock full of content that it's difficult to put any more in it, and trying to make this process a little easier for instructors. So we created this guide and called the Curriculum Guide on How to Infuse Deafblind Content. The title's pretty self-explanatory. So what we did was we looked through these resources. So for example, if we go back to the ones that are listed here, we went back and looked through them and said, okay, well, here's a place where you can embed a sort of deafblind scenario. And here's where you can find this content. Go to this chapter, go to this page, use this video footage, and helps kind of like alleviate the stress of having to hunt down those resources for yourself. This guide is also available for download for free, actually a variety of locations, and it's available on the National Task Force website, which is Deafblind Interpreting .org, or is it .com? And Rhonda hopefully will help me on that one. You go there, and this is available to you for free for download. And so it's just designed truly as a guide to say, if you're teaching thanks Rhonda, it's .org. My gut was right. Let's say, for example, you're teaching a course on deaf culture. Okay, well, of course, perfect opportunity. You absolutely want to talk about deaf-blind culture. Is there a deaf-blind culture? Well, here's a place to look. You go here, you can pull down this video footage, and you can find the content. So that guide is available to you for free and to assist in this process. So that's a lot of information, and I see that we are right down to the tail end here of our time together. I want to go back and look at the text chat box to see if there are any other thoughts, because this is a conversation, of course. I'm assuming you get the feeling that is very near and dear to my heart, and I could talk about it for hours on end. We don't have that opportunity, though. But I think it's really important, because if we've just gotten you to think a little differently and to sort of, begin to shift your paradigm, I think we are on our way. I'm looking back at the text box where Lisa was saying it's best to at least have an honorarium to pay a guest presenter. So that goes back to the whole budgetary issue. Absolutely. And I'm in strong support of that, because for those of us who've been in the field and particularly have done a lot of work in deafblindness, there's a lot of volunteering that comes up when it comes to deafblind related stuff. People expect people to volunteer their interpreting services or volunteer as an SSP or what have you. So since that's the case, we need to think about always having the conversation about it being supportive in terms of a field. This is working professionals. We are working as working interpreters, working with the broad spectrum of consumers. And so if that's the case, we don't want to be asking people or expecting people to constantly be volunteering their time, because we bring the same set of skills and knowledge base to any of the work that we do. So I'm going to look over here. Please do use the text chat box to post some questions. Carrie's reminding me we have a little more time than I had remembered. That's even better. So Willard is saying, I'm lucky that my IEP had an entire semester of deafblind communication. That's wonderful. So for a mentor and practicum host, do you have any tips? So Willard, let me just clarify. So there's a full semester, so a whole course on deafblind content, imagine. So in terms of practicum locations, I think your question is, and how to have hands-on experience. Well, there are different ways to do that. I think one of the ways would be to see what sort of activities are happening in your local community. It might be more difficult if you're located in a rural environment, but there may be groups of or pockets of individuals that you may not have been aware of initially. Different cities have pretty active deafblind communities, and to be able to look into that and to find that and go to those events. I mean, here on the East, I'm quite fortunate. We have Helen Keller in our backyard, so obviously there are practical experiences there, but that's the rarest of situations. So I would look within your local community. I would absolutely reach out and look and contact your state deafblind projects. So I mentioned them before. They are going to be your connection, because what the state deafblind projects know, they know where the kids are. They know where those kids and young adults, and not just children, but they know where those young adults are in their school environments, and then also know as they're transitioning out of high school into more of adult life. Are they going on to an educational environment or more of a vocational environment? And so they can definitely steer you in the right direction to get practicum experiences. I'm hoping that was kind of the way the question was going. I'm going to look up ahead and see if there are more questions to address. Perfect. Okay, we addressed that question. Judith is asking, do you have any suggestions for interpreting for low vision individuals in a VRS setting? Well, yes, absolutely. I've done quite a bit of video interpreting myself, and then did some consulting work for a large VRS company to address this issue, because all of a sudden we are doing and providing interpreting services in a very different way than we had in the past. All of a sudden, virtually, right, we were able to connect with people, and a whole host of issues then came up. But it was kind of interesting. Once we started talking about video, or video relay services. And even now, we have interpreters on the web, same sort of issues. What we started thinking about is, what are the challenges across video? And so regardless of vision loss, regardless of visual access of the consumer, general access to video was becoming challenging because now we're working with a two-dimensional screen, we're working against glare, we're working against issues of lighting, of background, of contrast. So it's kind of funny, all of a sudden this video world actually took all those sort of best practices or challenges relating to deafblind people and made it more everyday, made it more everyday challenges. So the dialogue about sort of environmental concerns in terms of video access became more common talk when VPs became very common. So a long answer to that question is absolutely. We can, in terms of use of technology, you can often enhance in terms of zooming. You can zoom the camera in on yourself to enlarge your screen to get you closer to the consumer. The consumer themselves can zoom you in on their side. The better the video technology, the more opportunities there are to make those modifications. You can also adjust your own saturation on the camera to make the contrast better and adjust that way. But what we have to think about more specifically is background. And so you can see here the interpreters on the screen. It makes a huge difference in terms of what's sitting behind them. I wasn't interpreting tonight, so I was a little less concerned. So you can see my plant is back there and the shelving. And so as you can imagine, if I was doing the interpreting, that would be very visually distracting. So you see the plain background with a nice contrast. And we have to think about ourselves then. What sort of background do we provide? I know my image is really small on this camera, so you probably can't see it right now, but I have dark clothing on, provides great contrast, but I also have a few bright silver buttons. And so that in and of itself can make or break communication, because if you have someone who pops up on the screen and tells you, oh, there I am on the camera. It got bigger. So as you can see, just that alone, because the silver will capture the lighting and there'll be glare. There'll be a response to that, which can be really distracting to someone who's already struggling through some visual information to see the message. So there are a whole host of ways that you can adjust just specifically in your own environment. So to review, you want to think about the backdrop, what's sitting behind you. Obviously, you want to think about your own lighting. Very significant in terms of the angle of the lighting, your clothing as a backdrop, and then be very comfortable about how to use the technology, because if you don't know how to jump in and out of those menu options during a call, that also can be challenging. So I would also talk, depending on your VRS provider, I would want to have a conversation with them to say, what sort of information do you have, and how are we prepared to work with any consumer as they pop on our screen? You also should be prepared that someone could pop up on your screen who is seated with someone who is providing tactile support. So very often you'll see someone who might be referred to as a CA, a communication assistant. Oftentimes it's referred to that, often more on the West Coast, or someone who's using what's referred to as an SSP, a support service provider. Or they may actually have an interpreter, hired an interpreter to help facilitate those telephone calls. And some VRS companies are helping provide that support also, paid support for deafblind people to access interpreting services over the video. So definitely things are evolving, things are changing. I think there's much more awareness going on, particularly with video. And I think for deafblind people, again, it's the great benefit just because there are inherently some issues in video or across the web that are directly applicable to people who are deafblind. So it's kind of ironic. So that was kind of a long answer to that question. I hope that information was helpful to you, Judy. Another point, I noticed our deafblind project is not very active. Deafblind children seem to be hidden and their needs are not being addressed appropriately. For instance, I'm an O&M instructor, and I'm just now seeing kids long after their vision is deteriorating. What do you suggest? Contact the coordinator and address this concern. Yeah, what's really important also to know, and because this specifically is the position that I work in, and I know those are my colleagues across the country, is I would absolutely engage with the Deafblind Project. And the challenge with the Deafblind projects, though, is that they're designed very differently from state to state. They are funded based on the population that is within that state. So if you have a smaller state or a more rural state with less numbers of people, there definitely be less numbers of deafblind kids. That means there are less dollars that are allocated for the Deafblind project. So feeling that they might not be very active, it truly could be, you may have the Deafblind project may actually be one person that's responsible for outreach. Oh, you're in Louisiana. That's a completely different story. Louisiana has a huge deafblind community down there in New Orleans, right? Well, if that's the case, then conversation has to be engaged. But I think we also have to think about, are we talking about the deafblind community as adults, or we're talking about youth, children and youth who are deafblind? Because oftentimes there is that divide between the two. But speaking specifically of children, absolutely, I would be speaking from the perspective of the coordinator of the New York grant. I would be thrilled to have a professional reach out to me and say, this is what I'm seeing, this is what our needs are, these are the needs of the kids, how can we do this better together? They need your services in the schools. Because one of the things that we struggle with, now granted, I'm in New York, which is a very large state, we surely cannot know where all the kids are, and it's even challenging to try to figure out where they are. We try to do a lot of outreach, a lot of awareness, both in person, via the web, etc. And so we're always thrilled when professionals contact us and do the outreach directly to us. That's what pulls us in. I actually just had a conference call today with a student that was real far western New York, and I wouldn't have known about that student except for one of the professionals who was there. It was actually the TVI. It was the teacher for the vision impaired who did the reaching out and did her own research. So someone with your knowledge and with your expertise, the Deafblind Project will benefit from having your involvement. So I would say absolutely, because our concern, and this was our concern even with the conference call I was on today, was the student is already a teenager with quite progressed vision loss in terms of field loss, and they're just now getting connected with us, and the student is already 17 years old. So soon they'll be transitioning out, already struggling with visual access with significantly reduced fields. So obviously that's going to impact the interpreter in the classroom in a mainstream setting and all the other pieces that come with it, and specifically with orientation and mobility, having not received those services. So my answer to that is absolutely, and I'd love to have a further conversation with you offline about that on ways to sort of get engaged. I don't see your name here. I just see it says Deafblind IEP. So maybe we'll get connected in a different way. Oh, Natasha. Hi, Natasha. So Natasha, you have to email me. I'm scrolling back up. If you can take the opportunity to also type some other questions, that would be great while I review. I'm looking up further. I see Debbie had mentioned, I work with the Deaf and Hearing Advocacy Resource Center, and we have a homeless deafblind person. Just want to see if I can learn new tips from all of you. Oh, great. That's good to know. Well, hopefully that there were some tips that kind of came up along the way in terms of resources. Carrie, I'm checking in with you also if there were additional questions that I missed, but I'm just sort of scrolling up. Oh, I see there was some sharing of the resources in the text box while I was jabbering away. That's great. So to go back to, I feel like we skipped through quickly, particularly around this guide, and I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to talk about the guide because it is quite readily available, and again, making it quite easy for you to incorporate information into the content. I think, again, talking about video content that is more state-of-the-art is more attractive. We have it's a younger, new age generation in terms of folks who are coming through the interpreter programs, and their expectations and access and technology are quite different than those of ours who went through a program years ago. So you want to keep thinking about, access to technology that is current and present, and this guide can help you identify some of those pieces. I see Catherine asked a question about what is charge syndrome. Well, that would be a whole other workshop, but I can talk to you briefly about that. So charge syndrome is an acronym, and I can put in here what each of those stand for. Basically, it's a genetic condition that is a combination of different aspects that are impacted. And I'm going to type it because it is complicated. So the C stands for coloboma, that's the piece that relates to the eye. Coloboma means lack of development or sort of a hole in usually the iris, or it could also be a hole or a gap missing in the optic nerve. So it's not necessarily in a way that's visible from the outside. The gap or the missing component could be actually somewhere internal. But that relates to the vision piece, and oftentimes the peripheral fields are affected, the upper peripheral fields, not on the sides, but the upper peripheral fields of vision. And so oftentimes students who have charge syndrome will walk with their heads up because they have to get their visual fields up higher. So they have to bring their head up to be able to access that vision. The range of vision loss with charge is very significant. It could be extremely mild all the way to no functional vision. The H stands for heart. Oftentimes there is some sort of complication with the heart with charge syndrome. Again, could be very mild, could be just sort of an arrhythmia, all the way to very significant holes in the heart that have to be repaired immediately after birth. A is a long one. It stands for atresia of the conae. This is why I'm spelling it on the text chat box. That relates to the whole nasopharynx area, so the whole nasal cavity and the upper palate cavity. And so many folks with charge syndrome are born with a cleft palate, a cleft lip. The actual nasal passage can be open. And so what relates to that then is a lot of sinus issues, swallowing issues directly at birth. And so there's usually a lot of corrective surgeries that are performed to put all those pieces back together where they're supposed to be. The R stands for retardation. It often does not relate to mental retardation, but relates to overall retardation of growth in terms of body growth, because there are some hormone issues that come into play, significant hormone issues, because the endocrine system is also affected. So oftentimes people with charge syndrome are quite small in stature, never really kind of grow much beyond a particular height. But then again, there is also referred to in terms of retardation, in terms of mental retardation, because oftentimes students with charge are cognitively impacted in some way. The G stands for genitalia, which is usually lack of development. That goes with the whole hormone system, endocrine system, and oftentimes that the genitalia is delayed in development or will not be developed, and families then have to make a decision about hormone replacement therapies and those sort of things. And then the E stands for ears, because the ears themselves are often placed lower on the skull, and then also the cartilage in the ears are often referred to as being more floppy sort of cartilage, and the ears don't want to stand up on their own, which can be a little tricky when it comes to hearing aids. And also relates to ear because that's where the hearing piece comes in. You can have an individual who has charge syndrome who has pretty typical hearing all the way up to someone who has charge who's profoundly deaf. Great ranges in development in terms of that. So, and thank you for putting up the website. So chargesyndrome.org is the place to go. They have a great website that talks about what charge syndrome is and talks about ways that you can get involved. They want to know, and like for you, the orientation mobility instructor, the TBIs that are on here, make sure you get connected because they want to know where you are also, because they need to be able to refer people to good folks like you, to the families that are out there. Catherine, you're welcome. I hope that that was helpful. But charge syndrome, we could do an all-day workshop, alone just on charge because it's really fascinating. And this is more of an up and kind of coming in terms of etiologies. This was been around for a while, but not well known. And so now the more that the medical community is becoming more aware of charge, more and more kids are being identified. And if you've been in the educational environment for a period of time and done interpreting services, you very well could have come across a student who has charge syndrome, especially if you work in the schools for the deaf. You look around there and pretty much you'll be able to see one or two kids walking down the hallway, whereas before things may have gotten overlooked. But the thing that we're also referring to charge syndrome as a syndrome. It used to be referred to as charge association. They're referring to now as a syndrome because similarly to other syndromes like Down syndrome, if you see a student who has Down syndrome, you know that based on the physical characteristics. And so this is also very similar to those who have charge syndrome. There are similar characteristics that you can identify. But what's important to know, in the last piece, we don't have to stay on charge syndrome, but what's important to know about charge is that since there's such a significant range of ability and life experience that you may hear that and say, oh, you'll never work with someone who has charge, when in fact that's probably not the case, because I've coordinated the interpreters and the SSPs, the charge conference that I mentioned, and we needed good interpreting services because there's a pool of young adults, some teens who are there who are college-bound participants. And so they need great interpreters just like any other deaf-sighted person needs, right? Oh, sounded like TBI, sorry, TV, Teachers for the Visually Impaired. There's a lot of acronyms in this field, right? We've got TVIs, we've got TODs, Teachers for the Deaf. Some of your states also will have deafblind specialists. That's another way to look. I would, again, go back to your state deafblind project and see if they themselves can provide consultation. But then just within some state departments, depending on how the State Department of Education is designed, often can have a specialty. And there are some states I know that have deafblind specialists. I would also go to the VR agencies, your vocational rehabilitation agencies, because very often they have someone who's been identified to be sort of the deaf-blind counselor, and they may have information. And this kind of goes back to the question before about locations for practicums or different host sites, that you may want to contact those places also to see in the VR setting if there are opportunities, because if they know more of the clientele, they may have opportunities for you there as well. Yes, that's right, Willard. Oklahoma, yeah, Oklahoma is really strong. They have a couple of deafblind specialists. New Jersey has deafblind specialists. I mean, many of the states across the country, again, very influenced by how the VR system has been designed in the state and also the State Department of Education. So, of course, here in New York, we are designed differently. We don't have those specific roles. New York is unique where it doesn't have a low incidence disability category, so there are there's no specific delineation for roles that could assist in that, other than ourselves. But again, we are the outside federal grant that's federally funded, not state funded. So some of your state projects actually have a mismatch of funds. They have, some of them have part federal dollars and part state dollars, which is actually good because it kind of embeds them in the state system more deeply than other places. Not that we want to spend too much time talking about syndromes, but of course you can't have a conversation about deafblindness and not talk about Usher syndrome. And so what we should talk about is that Usher syndrome is the leading cause of deafblindness in the deaf community, not in the general population, but within the deaf community. And so we want to talk about the type of language or terminology that your students or even working interpreters will come across. And so when they hear the words Usher syndrome, that way they can sort of build a schema of what to expect. And so what I think is important is to become familiar with Usher syndrome and understand that there's some variation within that syndrome and that not every consumer will look the same for sure. And it's helpful to understand perhaps the progression of that vision loss and how that plays out, just so people can kind of build that schema, which takes us back to the earlier slides, going back to the categories. If we look at thinking more simply about vision loss, about, well, what is close vision or low vision? What is the consumer from that experience? And talk about some of those types of eye diseases or vision conditions that would put someone in that category, as opposed to someone who has reduced peripheral fields of vision. And someone asked a question earlier, I think it was one of the TVIs, because they're the experts, could tell a lot better than me about, well, what is peripheral field loss? And what does that look like? Does it actually just kind of go in quickly from the sides and up and below? And that's actually not the case with Usher syndrome. It actually starts off with little scotomas or little blind spots, and then they get bigger. And so it's important to have that conversation, because what I find in the field is that, and you can think about it yourselves as working professionals, if you get a call from an interpreting agency and they say, oh, I have a consumer who has low vision, and say, okay, well, that's a particular schema. You create a schema in your mind about what that person, what they need. And then when you get on site, the person actually has Usher syndrome. So they don't have low vision. They don't have what would be considered to have that sort of close vision need. They have the opposite of that. So it's a completely different schema, completely different needs in terms of modifications. And so, again, why it's important to have conversation about syndromes and how it relates to the vision loss to help build that knowledge base and sort of the schemas and scenarios. I would strongly encourage you to go take a look at the National Task Force, their website. We put it up here earlier, and Rhonda reminded me that it's org in terms of resources that are available, how can they assist. There's information there also that can be downloaded for your use. And also just to be connected if you want to find out what sort of happenings are going on across the country. There is a listserv that you can get on there. There are a whole host of listservs actually that you could get connected to that is available to you in terms of information on deafblindness. If you are a professional working in the field, you can get on a listserv actually called Professionals Serving Deafblind Clients. So that's a great listserv. So it's great conversation. People will post questions specific about, sometimes it's syndrome specific, saying I just learned about this condition, I don't know anything about it, can someone help me? And talking about different resources. So as a professional to get involved there. Thanks, Rhonda. Rhonda put the email if they want to join the listserv to get on the National Task Force listserv to hop on there. I would also encourage you to get connected, if you're not already, with the deafblind member section of RID. The different regions, when there's regional conferences, will host a separate deafblind member section meeting, and oftentimes fundraisers and different professional development opportunities. So I would encourage you to get involved there. And there's a lot of community kind of participation that happens in those events too. Always at the national conference, we have our national conference coming up next summer. They there's always some sort of deafblind related content that's being offered, and so I'd encourage you to attend those sessions. At different times, we've been able to coordinate in conjunction with the deafblind member section, sometimes some really great parties and fundraisers to get people to bring the local deafblind community in wherever we are. I think next time we're in Indianapolis, I think that's correct. So we're going to have to look at our local deafblind community in that area and see if we can't connect. So there are many, many ways to get involved, but I think the biggest point, though, is to go back to how to become prepared, and that relates to, again, both you as an instructor or just as a practitioner. It is about content knowledge, and sure, book knowledge is helpful, understanding some of these terms, and just now quickly going over what charge syndrome is and Usher syndrome. It's important to have that language to talk about, but it's equally important, if not more important, to be able to say, I was there, I've done it, I've been there. And to be able to do that by going to these places, going to camps or retreats or weekend events. These are the places where you're going to really learn and to be able to hear people's stories. Some of the young adult events are really some of the absolute best events to go to because you get the real deal. You know, you hear it directly from the teens and learning how to make those modifications in a safe, in more of a relaxed environment that's outside of the classroom. If you're interested in getting involved in any of those type of events, let me share my email address here. It's deafblindtip@gmail.com, and if you're interested in getting involved in terms of volunteering, or if you'd also like to get on my listserv, I have a constant contact e-newsletter that goes out that it provides information about training opportunities and different volunteer opportunities, that sort of thing, so please feel free to hop on there. So there are a host of opportunities for you, and again, I would greatly encourage you to get involved. Any other thoughts to share here? I see the clock now is truly ticking because there are great innovative ways to get involved and share information. And these listservs are really great. That's a great way to do that. So I would encourage you to hop on there. If you'd like more information about online webinars, my site is here. It's deafblindtip.com, a whole host of live and recorded webinars that's all geared specifically to deafblindness. And again, different ways to virtually bring deafblind people into your office or into your classrooms. So I'd encourage you to think of very innovative ways that you could bring in deafblind content. Catherine asked you, did you say that Usher syndrome is a leading cause of deafblindness? Yes, Usher syndrome is the leading cause of deafblindness in the deaf community, very specifically, not in the general population. It's very difficult to capture across the entire population in terms of if we take sort of snapshots of age ranges, because if we look at the aging population, due to age-related issues of hearing and vision loss, obviously the numbers change significantly. But yes, within the deaf community. Is there any other last thoughts? I'm looking at the clock, and I want to look at Carrie to see if there are any other thoughts that you might want to add here. I've appreciated your time, and I truly hope that some information here was helpful. And again, if anything, if you walk away with a little bit of a shift in your paradigm, then I think that our time together was successful. And I hope, too, that if the information is a little less overwhelming than maybe it may have thought to be in the beginning. I know there's some questions about CEUs and things like that are kind of off of my list for tonight, and Dorothy, you're welcome. So thanks for having me, and best of luck. Please keep in touch.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was just amazing. And yes, I'm sure there are lots of questions about CEUs. The CEUs can be requested by completing the CEU request form, which will appear after the satisfaction survey is completed. The survey will open once you close out the webinar software. Submit the survey, and you will see a screen where you can click on the form to request CEUs. This form must be filled out to receive CEUs. If the survey doesn't automatically open once you close out, go to the web page for the webinar that was provided in the email sent to you today with the link to access the webinar tonight. The link to the survey is at the bottom of the page. A group sign-in sheet was attached to the email that was sent to you. If you watched in a group of individuals, please have everyone sign in and then submit the form to me. CEUs can be awarded via the sign-in sheet or the survey. Please encourage everyone to complete the survey even if you're using the sign-in sheet. And please take advantage of the listserv, which will begin on Monday. This is an amazing opportunity for you to go more in depth in this subject with Suzanne and your peers. So please look for that email that will be sent out tomorrow, and thank you all for coming.